Hi everyone, I'm Ani Tubaji, and I'm a cultural and regional economist. So what does this mean? Yesterday, Igor told us that, and repeated words said afore that we shouldn't take ourselves seriously. I take very seriously, however, my subject matter. Myself, no. But the subject matter culture, and I take it serious the way as economists do when they take a factor for choice seriously. So what do economists normally do when something is important? They want to define it. They want to know where it stands in the decision-making process, in the choice mechanism. And then when they bring the choice model to the data, they want to quantify this thing fully, because if they don't quantify it fully, as every quantitative person in whichever discipline is sitting knows, under-quantifying a main factor, a factor that matters for the mechanism, leads to under-specification and bias of the model, right? So these are essentially the problems that I have here creatively and playfully called the turtle problem and the elephant problem of culture. I'll go into defining them a little bit more clearly with you first. Then I will show you what are the solutions that culture-based development gives to these two problems. In order to do it, I had to learn from quite a lot of fields, because when I started my PhD, my professor was actually a labor economist, the kind of economist who takes things seriously. And, well, he was interested in culture. I made my literature review and I came with, well, there's no definition. And, you know, they measure it any possible kind of way. He was like, well, what's that? So let's do it seriously, right? Do whatever you want, learn from wherever you want, but come back with a proper definition that is clear and that can be then quantified in its fullness so that we make a test. And bless him, he's one of my personal saints. He gave me the time and space to go and learn. I learned from mainly cultural theorists, and among them Pierre Bourdieu and Weber, and I'll be speaking about how exactly I learned from them. And also, I tapped a little bit on psychology and the formation of emotion, right? And you'll see why. And my dream was to be able, because of Milgram and because my interest of emotions and choices with regards to political behavior, to meet a lot of, well, to read social psychology more and to meet more social psychologists. This was not happening, and there you are, my dream coming true. So it was very interesting, and I enjoyed everything that I heard. But the problem of this process of learning is that the different disciplines have different kind of final objective. While it seems like we all are talking about behavior, in order for it to be an economic quest, an economic research, the outcome should be an economic behavior, right? So for us, culture is an input in the choice, and the outcome is something economical. It cannot be culture, because if culture is the outcome of the decision-making process, then we say this is a sociological or a psychological kind of research from which we're happy to learn, but it's not an economic kind of question, right? So for me, the question is how culture is defined and how it enters into decision-making of people in order to bias their economic choices and take them away from the reasonable, rational outcome, right? Make their outcome suboptimal because of the presence of this cultural element in their choice. In other words, how culture creates a cultural bias in the economic choice and makes it not the best choice for the people and places. If you are now with me, let's deep into the, oops, no, this was too fast. Into defining what then culture is. It seems to me everybody is very much agreeing across disciplines that culture matters, but how we define it is always felt to be overwhelming and left to other discipline, or I will do it, but I always do it partially. So this comes from just from The Economist. Behind it is actually a book by a very nice young philosopher who is talking about, you know, how morality emerges and how we know what is good and evil. But actually, in my research, I borrow the wisdom from one name which was mentioned, but in a different context. And this is Geert Hofstede. Now, Hofstede, of course, is known for his cultural dimensions and with all the criticism about them, but I have used them, and I'm very grateful that he did this data collection, because before him there was no such data. But he said something much more important. He said that culture is the coding of the mind. Right? So you're a tabula rasa. If you're thrown to the wolves and they don't eat you up, but they breed you, you become a wolf as a behavior and as a culture. So this is a code for survival, a code about how you value every trigger from reality as good or bad for your survival, right? And this is a code of degree from 0 to 100. How good is this thing for my survival? If it's good for my survival, good. I feel good when I see it, and vice versa. That's how it's linked with emotions. And that's how it's also linked with something that economists call utility. Now, they have a lot of problem with utility. They kind of try to cut it out of economics and whatever, but utility is actually this feeling of happiness. If you're happy with something, or you're unhappy of something, if you have high utility or low utility from it. Then there is a problem. Because if culture is an amalgam of all our attitudes, what is good and what is bad, this is a really long list, a really long code. So we have to reduce this complexity somehow, because first of all, we cannot really observe it in its entirety. But in the same time, we do need to have a big enough cut off from this DNA of culture in order to be able to generate the necessary statistical information to characterize it properly in what it is, and integrate it in the model in a manner that it will not underspecify it and commit the problem that we discussed in the beginning. So, in other words, economists would say that this is a complex, dynamic entity. Dynamic because it also changes. And obviously, you cannot know how culture changes if you do not know what it is in the first place and what is its state and quantity in time one. There is a lot of work, and in economics and outside of it, on different cultural traits, and it's great work. So I really like the work of Alberto Bissin. It's one of the best works in cultural economics, for that matter. It's a theoretical work, but it's on different traits. And the problem is that some of the traits cancel out. So you may understand how one trait evolves and how the other traits evolve, but you should know the trade-off between them in order to know how the net of culture changed. And when there are many, many, then you're completely lost in understanding what is the actual net of culture due to one trait changing somewhere out there. So how do we handle this complex dynamic factor in order to understand its relevance for economic flourishing of individuals and places? What is the turtle problem? What is the elephant problem? How we solve it? And then I'll show you an empirical demonstration of this solution. Okay? Culture can be measured in 3 different ways. It can be measured either by the stated valuation of the triggers, which the World Value Survey is saying, how important is this thing for you? If you don't have this self-reported data, you could use language, and you can see the frequency of the use of the words. And the third, very interesting and very rarely used by new cultural economics economists measure, this is the consumption of culture. Because culture has to be, this code has to enter somehow in the system. And this entering in the system is at the first place teaching coming from the parent that is giving you the certainty, and that's why you are willing to encode it. Over time, you're taking it through aesthetic education. And this is culture is a capital that you get through this teaching in the same way that being taught at school is giving you cognitive skills for handling the reality. The aesthetic education is an education that is teaching you how to handle your emotions. And you have to have both forms of intelligence in order to survive better. And that's why evolutionary, it has been established out there. That's why also culture is part of our existence ever since we exist, right? and arts in the form of an expression of culture. So what I will show you as an empirical demonstration will be using the World Value Survey. And it will be using it because it is used by other economists, Desmet in specific, who made other measures for culture. And I will be comparing my measures with his measures in order to compare whether my approach is solving the problem better than the existing measures. So which are the problems? The turtle problem. The turtle problem is that economics went away from utility, went away from culture, went away from trying to understand what defines the preferences. And it started dealing only with preferences. So how do you choose among the things? What is the ordering between the triggers? But what causes this ordering was cut out of the question. So you can very precisely, with our mathematical models and statistical models that rationalize them, say when the demise will happen, but you have no idea why it started and how you can intervene. Then interest in culture reappeared. Culture Matters was for 10 years the big hit in economics to be repeated. A lot of Nobel awards were given to people who were a little bit scratching on the surface of this matter. And, well, an interesting word, but nobody defined culture for that time. And then it was institutions that came on the forefront. It was social capital that came on the forefront. It was identity that came on the forefront. These are things which exist in the literature review of my book. I won't go now in details. They're important things, but they're all derivatives of culture. So you can put them, but you still haven't put culture in. So the model remains without culture in the picture. Until you put culture as this code inherited and passed through generations, as anthropologists really tell us, you do not know where all the other cultural formations come from, and your model is underspecified. It is an infinite row of turtles that lack the foundation, and the foundation is culture. I'll go in a second in detailing why this is also empirically important. So the turtle problem is they don't know why we have utility, they don't know why we have preferences and institutions and social capital and other soft things that have been recognized, but they're not culture. The answer to this question, why, is culture. We say culture-based development, and this is my paradigm, my approach to studying culture, because culture is in the beginning of the causal chain, how we make our mind to make decisions about the world. If we don't have culture, we don't know how to value things, and then we cannot make choices. So this is the other way to decide what to do is purely experiential, but this is not culture, this is our survival memory, right? And we are willing to have a market for culture with society, because by agreeing to print the cultural code that society gives us, this increases our survival chances. Because this code has been tested, right? And we don't have to poke every time the snake and the lion and jump in the fire to find out it's not a good idea, right? And it comes from a trustworthy source, which is our parent, who has brought us about. And that's why we would learn it also from a wolf, if the wolf has been kind enough to save us around. So this is the first problem. The second problem is the elephant problem. The elephant problem is that it's very fashionable, especially in new cultural economics, to have a new variable. That's about culture. If you have that, you rock. And if it's a historic one, even better. So you have an instrument, right? Yay. And many interesting papers have been published in this manner. The problem is that they are just as the myth that most of you know very well. Somebody is holding the leg of an elephant, somebody is holding the trunk of an elephant, another the tail, and they're saying, well, that matters, but they describe it differently. And I was flagging this, saying that using monodimensional measures is not a great idea because each of them shows a separate aspect of what culture is. And if you use only one measure, you may not understand the entire entity, how it is, and what's the variation of the whole entity. I was saying it, but who am I to say it? But recently, there was a very interesting paper, well, relatively recently, by Desmet and some colleagues. And I just loved these people when I read this paper, because what they did was to try to measure cultural diversity, right? And they used, on the one side, language, and on the other side, like ethnicity and the attitudes to trust. And to cut a long story short, if you use these different measures and then try to make a map of the cultural diversity, the maps will be very different. And they themselves said in the paper, well, what do we measure when we measure culture with different proxies, right? So this is a really important lesson, and it hits in the heart of the fact that if we under-quantify culture by measuring it monodimensionally and not in terms of all the code and the way that things cancel out with trade-offs between the different attitudes inside, we may under-quantify an important thing that matters for the model. So this is our elephant problem. Do we measure culture in its entirety when we use just a separate proxy? No, this is a problem. We have to solve it. To recapitulate, we have to know how utility emerges. It emerges because of culture. We have to know how to measure then this culture. And the way to do this is important because it leads to improving our specification of the model. It's also important to note here that this highlights that all that I said up to here, that culture is not a special niche in economics. Culture underlies each and every choice, simply because you cannot even choose how to eat a steak if you don't have culture. Because if you are a German, you say, you know, piggies are nice, they bring the salt on their back, and let's eat this nice steak. And if you are a Muslim or a Jew, you're like, that's dirty, right? So even for a simple thing like that. But it then carries on in many other dimensions of our life, which get more and more important and significant. So how can we resolve it? I've written a book. You might have seen the poster over there. I would be very happy to have a picture with you and the poster. But because, and we're recording this because I'm making a little tour among the different groups where I learned, and I want now to show them how I understood them and how I have translated it in a consistent theory together. What this book does is it is first defining culture and giving a literature review of the different fields, defining it as an amalgam of attitudes, right, and this code, and then saying the important thing in this amalgam that has to be captured and quantified in the model is its power to influence choice. So this power is cultural capital. Now, I'm not alone when I call this cultural capital. The person who coined this term is Pierre Bourdieu. Bourdieu is very difficult, and that's in the way he writes, and many economists hate that. They prefer simple things. That's why they ignore him. But he explains explicitly what's the difference between cultural capital and social capital, right? And all the other mentioned things, institutions and so on. So we want this power of culture to influence choice to quantify. Where does this power come from? It comes from determining how we handle the reality, whether we are rigid in a way this goes into the tightness, whether we are rigid towards the world which is around us and we just do what culture tells us, or we are open and we can intellectually open or open-minded, as you said it, but in regional economics this is called openness. So whether we are open to adapt our survival code to the environment which is around us. And this determines whether the culture will be monolithic and closed and printing things from the past, or will be one which is more open to learning and for us to adapt faster and to learn from everybody who is around us and then survive more successfully. So this is the nature of cultural capital and the characteristic that has to be captured in the measurement. In other words, cultural capital has two components: cultural heritage, the attitudes, the way that they're imprinted from the past, and living culture, the part of the attitudes that are currently created adaptively in a way that is now decided according to the environment around us. And we have to know the balance between these two things within the cultural capital in order to be able to characterize the cultural capital locally as a milieu which will be conducive to survival in a different manner. It will be less conducive to survival if it is a closed one, and it will be more conducive to survival, more supportive to survival if it is an open kind of a culture where the cultural heritage and living culture are balanced between each other. Now, there is a measure which is coming from complex theory, which is used for reducing complexity and understanding how the balance between the elements in a complex entity are situated with each other. And this is the Shannon entropy measure. Somebody mentioned entropy. Well, I want to make an entropy measure for culture. So, empirically speaking, you can make factor analysis or any other kind of data reduction method in order to use as many attitudes as you have and obtain the living culture and cultural heritage component. I have written something like 50 papers. I've used many different kinds of data sets, for super crappy to very big data sets. And it always comes out that you have these two factors. So it might be first living culture and cultural heritage. And once they are defined, then the elbow immediately appears. And you may have a little bit more, but the main, like 90% of what culture is in the first two factors, which are living culture and cultural heritage. And then once you have them, you keep their loadings and you can sum them up and understand what percentage of the sum is going for cultural heritage, what's going for living culture. And this empowers you into being able to construct this entropy measure, which is giving you an indication whether the local cultural milieu is balanced and people can learn from each other and it's open, or whether it is closed and one of the types locally, either what is inherited as culture or what is being shaped culturally today is skewed, right? And then the learning space and the survival chances of this person are going down. Once you know to characterize culture in this way, you can then examine the effect of culture in terms of the present cultural heritage and living culture and their balance, the cultural entropy, which quantify properly the entirety of culture in terms of how they relate to outcomes. And the outcomes will be economic outcomes. I, in the book, go into how it predicts your choice of where to migrate, how it predicts where to make innovation, or how it predicts your voting, how it predicts whether you cooperate with somebody or not using the Edgeworth box. And then you can use all the economic methodology, all these models already exist in economics. You just augment them with the cultural component and you see what is the effect of it for the outcome. So with regards to the turtle problem, we can turn it into a hypothesis that you have culture, now defined as cultural heritage, living culture, and the Shannon entropy, are the driver behind the formation of your preferences. So this is the essence of this hypothesis. So we will take here the preference for public good provision. In the World Value Survey, there were questions how good it is from 1 to 10 to have literacy and how good it is to have electricity. So these are attitudes for public good provision. We will see whether they're explained by cultural heritage, living culture, and the entropy measure. And I like always making things a little bit complex, and I see it already on your faces that you appreciate that. So the next step that you can do is to see whether the thus-shaped preferences then determine the actual behavior of the local institutions. You can make just a system of equations, and it will be a recursive system because the part that you inherit is coming from a period before you were born. So it's quite easy to handle it. So this is the first, but the sense of the first hypothesis is culture determines, drives, shapes the preferences for public good provision. The second hypothesis is that if you do it this way, the culture-based development way, then your specification, culturally augmented specification, will perform better than any other specification which is expressing culture in a monodimensional way. Okay? In other words, the overall explanatory power of a choice model that is augmented in the culture-based development approach will be a higher explanatory power than the explanatory power of any other culturally augmented model that has culture measured in a monodimensional way. And in order to be sure that I'm doing it right and that I'm in a good company, I use the measures of Desmet. And I compare his measures in this nice paper that he had with my culture-based development measures, also because he uses the fractionalization index, which is quite famous, but it has a trouble. And I'll go back to it. Many people have criticized it. So I already said that we're using the Desmet case. His paper was going only up to 2008. There are more waves now, but I do it the way that he did it in order to speak to his paper. I use the 200 variables of the whole survey to make the kind of factor analysis that you see there. You see how the first two factors take quite much more of the variation than anything else that's doing those there. Then it will be focused on public. The whole paper has also conflict outcome, but I'll focus on the public good only. Now the cultural measures. These three here are the fractionalization, the fixation index, and the distance index defined as you see there. If you want more detail on how they are actually defined, go read the paper. I don't have the time. I think I already have 3 minutes only left. But let's take the fractionalization one and see how cultural-based development does things better and why it has the highest predictive power here. Well, the fractionalization index is cool. It was a novelty, and many nice people like Alessina, for instance, made it famous. But the thing is, it tells you how likely it is that you meet somebody who is different, right? Now, if I find a Japanese or a Canadian, great. If I find somebody who is slightly less amicable, it might be a different kind of encounter. This is what the fractionalization index cannot capture, and this has been criticized in the literature, that it's difficult to predict polarization by using it in its overly sterile way. How culture-based development does this differently? Well, it says you can measure the cultural heritage and living culture of A and the cultural heritage and living culture of B, and you can understand how different they are. But this difference now is the main thing that can be perceived either as a source of, ooh, this is giving me uncertainty, this is something different from me, I treat this person as otherness, this is how, you know, the identity of othering can emerge. Or you can say, how interesting, this person is doing it differently, let me ask this person why the hell he's doing it differently, and you may learn something. And also, the point is, when you learn it, will you be just copy-pasting because it's a fashion coming from somebody else, which might be actually very wrong because it can be a very stupid person, right? Or whether you will have the balance to say, okay, let me reflect reasonably, is this good or bad for my survival indeed, without the bias, and then go ahead. You can do this by taking the cultural entropy measure that I told you about, right? Most probably some of you already are clicking into how it will do it, but I'll go over it just for the clarity of everyone. If you have the cultural entropy at its, we have only two classes, so the max will be 1. If cultural entropy is at 1, you will have this difference being perceived for its rational meaning within the decision-making process. You will learn, you will appreciate what is the meaning of this information, will it really increase your survival or not, and you will make a decision without cultural bias, essentially, if the entropy is at max. If the entropy is going towards copying the past, you will say, no, this is a source of uncertainty, I don't want to deal with it. If it is going towards just appreciating new things, you will immediately copy-paste again without appreciating reasonably, again with a bias, no matter, the one will be taste for discrimination, the other will be a nepotistic bias, right, towards the idea coming from something which is different. But in all these cases, you will know precisely how big source of uncertainty you have because of the difference in culture, heritage, living culture, and how much in magnitude it will matter depending on where is the cultural entropy. If the cultural entropy is close to 1, you will have almost no importance of this difference for decision making. But if it is tipped towards one of the types of cultural capital, then you will have a strong cultural bias, and you even can interact it eventually with the cultural heritage living culture if you have enough observations, and you can understand whether it will be nepotistic, whether it will be, yeah, 1 minute. Fine. So now let me see how I smash everything into 1 minute. So methodologically, the first will be just an OLS, or you can make it into a 3-stage least square if you want to have the system of equations, where you will have culture, heritage, living culture, and Shannon entropy explaining the preference for certain public goods, and then and I assume the public good is improving the inequality, that's why it's called preference for inequality. And then you have the public good expenditure, which is taken from the World Bank. And you have, again, from the World Value Survey, the preference, which is the outcome in the first equation, and Z, which can be a battery of controls. We can discuss them in the discussion if there is time for it. And in the second hypothesis, it's just regressions in which you have the behavior, so this World Bank actual investment in education, and it is explained with culture heritage, living culture, and Shannon entropy. Why? Because I'm using the chain rule. If it is that culture heritage, living culture, and Shannon entropy determine the preference, and that the preference determines the public good expenditure, then the public good expenditure by the chain rule is caused by culture heritage, living culture, and Shannon entropy, right? And this allows me to make the specification in this manner. I take the behavior of the institutions and I explain it with something cultural because of the chain rule. And then I use 3 different measures coming from Desmet and 1 from the culture-based development, and I compare the adjusted R squares from these specifications.